The dust kicked up behind Michael's beat-up Honda as he pulled into the gravel driveway of what his family called the Money Pit, his late grandmother's run-down farm in rural Oklahoma. His cousins had laughed when Grandma Rose left him the worthless, wandered 60 acres instead of cash like everyone else. Little did they know, he was about to discover something in that old barn that would make them regret every mocking word they'd ever said. Michael Torres, 28, stepped out of his car and surveyed the property that had been in his family for 3 generations. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth, highlighting every flaw in the landscape before him. The white farmhouse, once pristine according to old family photos, now stood like a weathered monument to neglect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you, paint peeled. From its wooden siding in long curling strips, and several shutters hung at odd angles. The wraparound porch that Grandma Rose had been so proud of sagged in the middle, its boards warped and splitting from years of Oklahoma weather. The property stretched out in all directions, 160 acres of what most people would call wasteland. The pasture grass had grown wild and tall, interrupted by patches of red clay earth where nothing would grow. An old windmill stood motionless in the distance, its blades frozen despite the constant prairie wind. Rusted farm equipment dotted the landscape like metallic tombstones, relics from the days when this place had actually been a working farm. Michael walked slowly toward the house, his footsteps crunching on the gravel drive. He could almost hear his cousin Bradley's voice from the funeral last month, echoing in his memory with that familiar tone of smug superiority. Poor Mike got stuck with Grandma's junk pile while the rest of us got actual money. I mean, what's he supposed to do with a falling down farm? He doesn't know the first thing about agriculture. The reading of the will had been a masterclass in family cruelty. Michael's Aunt Patricia, Bradley's mother, had received $50,000 in cash. His cousin, Jennifer, got the same amount, along with Grandma Rose's vintage jewelry collection. Even his youngest cousin, Tyler, who hadn't visited Rose in over 5 years, walked away with $25,000 and the family's antique dining set. Then came Michael's turn. The lawyer had cleared his throat awkwardly before announcing that Rose Torres had left her entire 160-acre property to her grandson Michael, along with all buildings, structures, and contents therein. The room had fallen silent for exactly 3 seconds before the laughter began. "Contents therein?" Bradley had snorted. "What contents? Rusty tractors and moldy hay?" Aunt Patricia hadn't even tried to hide her disdain. "Well, at least we know who the favorite was," she'd said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Too bad favorites don't pay property taxes. Michael, honey, you might want to talk to a realtor about unloading that place before it bankrupts you." Jennifer had been the cruelest of all. "Maybe you can turn it into some kind of artsy retreat," she'd suggested with mock encouragement. "You know, for struggling artists like yourself. Assuming you can afford to keep the lights on?" What they didn't understand, what they'd never bothered to learn, was that Michael had been the only grandchild who truly knew Rose Torres. While his cousins were climbing corporate ladders and building suburban empires, Michael had spent countless weekends at this very farm. He'd helped Rose tend her vegetable garden, learned to identify every bird that nested in the old oak trees, and sat on that sagging porch listening to her stories about the early days of Oklahoma oil country. Rose had emigrated from Mexico as a young woman, following her husband, Thomas Torres, to Oklahoma during the oil boom of the 1940s. She'd told Michael stories about the wildcatters and roughnecks who used to frequent the local diner, about the families who'd struck it rich overnight, and the ones who'd lost everything chasing dreams in the dirt. "This land has secrets, mijo," she used to say, her weathered hands gesturing across the property. "It's patient. It waits for the right person to understand what it's trying to say." Standing in the oppressive Oklahoma heat, Michael felt the full weight of his family's expectations crushing down on him. At 28, he was barely making ends meet as a freelance graphic designer, working out of a cramped studio apartment in Tulsa's Arts District. His client base was small but growing, consisting mainly of local businesses and the occasional nonprofit that appreciated his creative eye but couldn't afford big agency prices. The property taxes on 160 acres would eat up most of his meager savings. The farmhouse would need a new roof before winter, probably new plumbing too. The barn looked like it might collapse if someone sneezed too hard in its direction. Maybe his family was right. Maybe Rose had burdened him with a financial albatross, disguised as an inheritance. But Michael had something his cousins didn't know about, something that had gnawed at his curiosity for years. In his pocket, warm from the afternoon heat, was an ornate brass key that Rose had worn on a thin chain around her neck for as long as he could remember. She'd never taken it off, not even when she showered or slept. And she'd never let anyone, not even Michael, go inside the old barn. "Some things are meant to wait for the right time, mijo," she used to say whenever he asked about it, that mysterious smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "When the time comes, you'll know." Michael pulled the key from his pocket and held it up to the sunlight, studying its intricate engravings for the 100th time. The brass was worn smooth in places from decades of handling, but the detailed patterns were still visible, strange symbols that didn't match any alphabet he recognized. Today, with his inheritance official and his family's mockery still ringing in his ears, felt like the right time to finally discover what Rose Torres had been protecting in that weathered barn for all these years. He looked across the property, toward the old structure, its red paint faded to a dusty pink, and made a decision that would change everything. The barn stood about 50 yards from the house, larger than it appeared from a distance, with heavy wooden doors secured by a rusted chain and an ancient padlock. As Michael approached, he noticed something he'd never seen before: fresh tire, tracks in the dirt leading right up to the barn doors, even though the farm had been empty since Rose's death 2 months ago. Someone had been here recently. Someone with a vehicle much larger than his Honda. The tire tracks were deep and wide, clearly made by a heavy truck or SUV within the past week. Michael knelt down and examined them more closely, his graphic design training having taught him to notice details others might miss. The tread pattern was aggressive, like something you'd see on a work vehicle or expensive off-road truck. More troubling was the fact that there were multiple sets of tracks, suggesting several visits or more than one vehicle. Michael's mind raced, with possibilities. Had someone been trying to break into the barn? The property was isolated enough that trespassers could come and go without being noticed by neighbors. The nearest house was almost a mile away, belonging to old Frank Whitman, who Rose had mentioned was practically deaf and spent most of his time watching television with the volume turned up to ridiculous levels. As he stood up, brushing the red Oklahoma dust from his knees, Michael's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Bradley, and the timing felt almost supernatural in its cruelty. "Hey, cuz, just wanted to check in on your new empire. Mom says we should throw you a housewarming party. Maybe we can roast hot dogs over the burning mortgage papers." Michael stared at the message for a long moment before shoving the phone back into his pocket without responding. Bradley had always been like this. The golden child who'd graduated from Oklahoma State with a business degree and immediately landed a management position at his father-in-law's oil equipment company. While Michael had struggled through art school on scholarships and part-time jobs, Bradley had lived in a fraternity house funded by his parents and spent spring breaks in Cancun. The contrast between their lives had only grown starker over the years. Bradley now lived in a gated community in Edmond, drove a brand-new F-150 King Ranch Edition, and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone about his success. His social media was a constant stream of expensive dinners, golf outings, and vacation photos with captions like, "Living the dream," and "Hard work pays off." What Bradley didn't know, what none of them knew, was how much those weekend visits to Rose's farm had shaped Michael's understanding of real wealth. Rose had taught him to see value in things that couldn't be measured in dollars. She'd shown him how to appreciate the way morning light filtered through the oak leaves, how to read the weather in the behavior of the barn cats, how to find peace in the simple act of sharing a meal with someone who truly cared about you. "Money comes and goes, mijo," Rose used to tell him while they worked in her garden. "But land, family, and knowledge, those things last forever. Your cousins, they chase after shiny things that break or get lost. You understand what really matters." Michael had always thought she was just being philosophical, the way elderly people sometimes got when reflecting on their lives. Now, standing in front of the mysterious barn with fresh tire tracks at his feet, he wondered if there had been more substance to her words than he'd realized. He walked around the perimeter of the barn, looking for other signs of recent activity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The structure was larger than most people realized, probably dating back to the 1940s when Rose and Thomas had first purchased the property. The foundation was solid limestone, still strong after all these decades, but the wooden siding showed the effects of 70-plus years of prairie weather. Several boards were loose, creating gaps that allowed glimpses into the dark interior, but the openings were too narrow to see anything meaningful. On the north side of the barn, Michael discovered something that made his heart race. Someone had attempted to pry off one of the loose boards, leaving fresh gouge marks in the weathered wood. The marks were recent. The exposed wood underneath was still light-colored, not yet darkened by exposure to the elements. Whoever had been here wasn't just curious. They were actively trying to get inside. Michael pulled out his phone and called the only person he trusted to give him straight advice about the situation. His friend Carlos Mendoza had grown up on a farm about 20 miles south and now worked as a county sheriff's deputy. If anyone would know how to handle potential trespassers, it would be Carlos. "Miguel," Carlos answered on the second ring, using the nickname he'd called Michael since they were kids. "How's the gentleman farmer life treating you?" "That's actually why I'm calling," Michael said, grateful to hear a friendly voice. "I'm out at Rose's place. My place now, I guess. And there are signs that someone's been poking around. Fresh tire tracks, marks on the barn like someone tried to break in." Carlos's tone immediately became more serious. "You out there alone right now?" "Yeah, why?" Rural properties that sit empty for a while sometimes attract the wrong kind of attention. Could be kids looking for a place to party, could be someone thinking about stripping copper wire or stealing equipment, could be worse. "You armed?" Michael almost laughed. "Carlos, you know me. The most dangerous thing I own is an X-Acto knife." "Well, maybe it's time to change that." "Look, I'm about to finish my shift. Want me to swing by and take a look?" "Official capacity, just to be safe." Michael felt a wave of relief. "Would you? I'd really appreciate it. Give me about 30 minutes. And Miguel, don't go wandering around alone until I get there. If someone's been casing the place, they might still be in the area." After hanging up, Michael looked back at the barn with new eyes. The mysterious key in his pocket seemed to burn with possibility, but Carlos was right about being cautious. Whatever secrets Rose had hidden in that barn had waited this long. They could wait another half hour until backup arrived. As he walked back toward his car to wait for Carlos, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The feeling was probably just paranoia brought on by the discovery of the tire tracks, but he found himself scanning the tree line and checking the rearview mirror of his Honda as if someone might be observing his every move. He was about to find out just how right that feeling was. Michael had just settled into his car when the sound of an approaching vehicle made him look up from his phone. A massive black Chevrolet Suburban with tinted windows was turning into the driveway, moving slowly and deliberately like a predator, stalking prey. This wasn't Carlos. His friend drove a beat-up Ford pickup that sounded like it needed a new muffler. This vehicle was expensive, well-maintained, and definitely not what Michael had expected to see on his grandmother's isolated farm. The Suburban came to a stop about 20 feet away from Michael's Honda, positioned in a way that would make it difficult for him to leave quickly. Two men got out of the front seats, and Michael immediately understood that these weren't random trespassers or curious neighbors. They moved with purpose and authority, wearing dark business suits that looked completely out of place in rural Oklahoma. The driver was tall and lean with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from expensive vacations, not farm work. His passenger was younger, broader, with the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym. "Mr. Torres?" the older man called out as he approached Michael's car, his voice carrying the polished confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I'm Richard Blackwood from Blackwood Energy Solutions. This is my associate, Mr. Kane." Michael rolled down his window but remained seated, every instinct telling him to be cautious. "Can I help you with something?" Blackwood's smile was perfectly crafted, the kind that looked warm but never reached the eyes. "I hope so. We understand you've recently inherited this property from Rose Torres. Please accept our condolences. She was quite a remarkable woman." "You knew my grandmother?" Michael asked, studying the man's face for any sign of genuine emotion. "We had several conversations over the years," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Rose was, shall we say, protective of her land. But we're hoping you might be more open to discussing a business proposition." Kane stepped closer to the car, and Michael noticed the way his jacket bulged slightly under his left arm. The man's stance and alertness suggested military or law enforcement background, but there was something predatory about him that made Michael's skin crawl. This wasn't someone who protected and served. This was someone who intimidated and enforced. "What kind of business proposition?" Michael asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. Blackwood reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "We'd like to make you an offer for your property. A very generous offer considering the current condition of the land and buildings." Michael glanced at the envelope but made no move to take it. "I appreciate the interest, but I'm not looking to sell. I just inherited the place." Of course," Blackwood said, his tone remaining pleasant but with an undercurrent that suggested patience had limits. "I understand the sentimental value, but Mr. Torres, let's be practical here. You're a young man trying to make his way in the world. This property is a financial burden. Property taxes, maintenance, utilities. It's eating into your savings account as we speak." The fact that Blackwood knew details about Michael's financial situation sent a chill down his spine. How much research had these people done on him? How long had they been watching? Kane stepped even closer, now standing directly beside Michael's door. "Your grandmother was stubborn," he said, his voice carrying none of Blackwood's artificial warmth. "Stubbornness can be expensive." "Is that a threat?" Michael asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Blackwood held up a hand in a gesture of mock peace. "Not at all, Mr. Torres. Simply an observation about the realities of property ownership in rural Oklahoma. But let's not dwell on unpleasantness. Open the envelope. I think you'll find our offer quite compelling." Michael reluctantly took the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of official letterhead. The number at the bottom made his breath catch in his throat. $2.3 million. For a property his family had mocked as worthless, the offer was staggering. That's a lot of money," Michael said, trying to process what he was seeing. "It is indeed," Blackwood agreed. "More than enough to pay off any student loans, buy a house in a nice part of Tulsa, maybe start your own design firm. Financial freedom, Mr. Torres. The kind of security your grandmother never had." Michael looked up from the paper, his mind racing. If the property was worth this much to Blackwood Energy Solutions, there had to be a reason. "Why?" he asked. Why is this land worth so much to your company?" For just a moment, Blackwood's smile faltered, and Michael caught a glimpse of something calculating and cold underneath the polished exterior. "We believe the property has potential for development. Agricultural improvements, perhaps some light industrial use. Nothing that would disturb the natural beauty of the area." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Companies didn't offer $2.3 million for agricultural development on land that barely grew weeds. There was something else here, something valuable, enough to warrant this kind of money and this kind of pressure. "I need time to think about it," Michael said, folding the paper and handing it back to Blackwood. The older man's smile became strained. "Of course, but Mr. Torres, opportunities like this don't come along often. Market conditions change, economic factors shift. I'd hate for you to miss out on such a generous offer because you waited too long." Kane leaned down until his face was level with Michael's window. "Your grandmother made the mistake of thinking she could hold out forever," he said quietly. "Look where it got her." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. "What did you just say?" "Mr. Kane," Blackwood said sharply, though whether he was warning his associate or simply playing good cop to Kane's bad cop was unclear. "What my colleague means is that Rose lived her entire life on this property without ever realizing its full potential. Don't make the same mistake." Michael's phone buzzed with a text from Carlos. 5 minutes out. The timing couldn't have been better. "I really do need to think about this," Michael said, starting his car's engine. "You have my number?" "We do," Blackwood said, stepping back from the vehicle. "But Mr. Torres? Don't think too long. This offer expires in 48 hours. As Michael drove away from the two men, his hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel, he couldn't stop thinking about Kane's words about his grandmother. The way he'd said them, the timing, the implications. It felt like more than just a business negotiation tactic. It felt like a confession. Michael drove toward the main road, his heart pounding as he watched the black Suburban in his rearview mirror. Blackwood and Kane stood beside their vehicle, watching him leave with the kind of predatory patience that made his skin crawl. They weren't following him, but somehow that made it worse. They were confident he'd be back, confident that their offer would eventually break down his resistance. As soon as he was out of sight of the farm, Michael pulled over at a gas station and called Carlos back. His hands were still shaking as he dialed, the weight of Kane's implied threat about Rose settling into his stomach like a cold stone. "Miguel? Everything okay?" "You sound rattled," Carlos answered immediately. "I need you to meet me at the farm. But be careful. There were 2 men here when I left, guys in suits with a black Suburban. They made me an offer I couldn't refuse, except I'm pretty sure refusing might be dangerous." "What kind of offer?" Carlos's voice had shifted into his cop tone, all business and alertness. $2.3 million for Rose's property, from something called Blackwood Energy Solutions. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Miguel, that's a lot of money for 160 acres of farmland, even good farmland." That's what I thought too. But Carlos, one of them, this guy Kane, he said something about Rose that made it sound like maybe her death wasn't as natural as we thought. Another pause, longer this time. "What exactly did he say?" Michael recounted the conversation, paying special attention to Kane's words about stubbornness being expensive and Rose's refusal to hold out forever. The way he said, "Look where it got her," Carlos, it sounded like a threat, but also like he knew something about what happened to her. "Miguel, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't go back to that property alone. In fact, don't go back there at all until I can run these guys through the system and see what comes up." "Blackwood Energy Solutions, you said?" "Yeah." Richard Blackwood was the smooth talker. Kane was the muscle. Professional operation, expensive clothes, the whole 9 yards. "I'll check them out and meet you at the farm in about an hour. I want to take a look at those tire tracks you mentioned and see if there's any other evidence of tampering. But Miguel, if these guys show up again, you call me immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself." After hanging up, Michael sat in his car outside the gas station, trying to process everything that had happened. 3 hours ago, he'd driven to Rose's farm expecting to reminisce about his grandmother and maybe poke around the property. Now he was sitting with a $2.3 million offer in his pocket and a growing suspicion that his grandmother's death might not have been the peaceful passing everyone had assumed. His phone buzzed with another message, this time from Jennifer. "Bradley told me about your inheritance adventure. Mom thinks you should just sell the place and split the money with the family since it should have been divided equally anyway. Just saying." The casual cruelty of the message hit him like a slap. Even now, with everything that was happening, his family's first instinct was to find a way to profit from his situation. The idea that he should sell Rose's property and split the money with the same people who had mocked both him and the farm just hours earlier was so absurd. It made him angry. But more than that, it made him determined. Whatever Rose had hidden in that barn, whatever secret had made Blackwood Energy Solutions willing to pay millions for seemingly worthless land, his family didn't deserve to benefit from it. They'd written off both him and Rose years ago. They'd made their choice, and now they could live with the consequences. Michael scrolled through his contacts and called his closest friend from art school, a guy named David who worked as an investigative journalist for the Tulsa World. If anyone could, help him research Blackwood Energy Solutions and figure out what they really wanted with Rose's land, it would be David. "Michael Torres, how's the starving artist's life treating you?" David answered with his characteristic humor. "Actually, I think I might have stumbled onto something big. You ever heard of a company called Blackwood Energy Solutions?" "Energy company?" Doesn't ring a bell, but that doesn't mean much. "Why?" Michael gave David the abbreviated version of events, focusing on the mysterious offer and the implied threats. David's tone became more serious as the story progressed. "Okay, that's definitely sketchy," David said when Michael finished. "Energy companies don't usually offer millions for farmland unless there's something specific they want. Oil, natural, gas, mineral rights, something like that. You know anything about your grandmother's property contracts?" "Not really. I mean, I know she and my grandfather bought the place in the 1940s, but I never saw any of the paperwork." "Well, that paperwork might be the key to everything. Property deeds, mineral rights agreements, oil and gas leases, that stuff could explain why these guys are so interested. Plus, if they're willing to offer $2.3 million up front, the property is probably worth a lot more than that." Michael felt a spark of hope. "Could you help me research this? I mean, officially?" "You bet. This sounds like exactly the kind of story my editor loves. Corporate interests pressuring ordinary people, potential environmental issues, maybe even some corruption if these guys have been throwing their weight around with other landowners. Give me everything you know about Blackwood Energy Solutions, and I'll start digging." After providing David with all the details he could remember, Michael felt slightly better about his situation. He wasn't alone in this, and he had people he could trust. Carlos would handle the security and law enforcement angle. David would investigate the corporate side, and Michael could focus on what Rose had wanted him to find in that barn. But first, he needed to get back to the property and make sure Blackwood and Kane were gone. He also needed to get inside that barn before they figured out another way to force their way in. Whatever Rose had hidden there, it was clearly valuable enough to kill for. The thought made him check his mirrors again as he drove back toward the farm. This time, he noticed a dark sedan that seemed to be following him at a distance, staying just far enough back to avoid being obvious, but close enough to keep track of his movements. Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Blackwood and Kane weren't just making business offers, they were actively surveilling him. The question was how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted, and whether Michael would be able to stay ahead of them long enough to uncover the truth about Rose's legacy. As he turned onto the road leading to the farm, the sedan continued, straight, but Michael wasn't fooled. They knew where he was going, and they probably knew he'd be back. The real question was whether they'd be waiting for him when he arrived. Part 5. When Michael pulled back into the farm's driveway 20 minutes later, the black Suburban was gone. But the feeling of being watched had only intensified. He parked near the farmhouse and sat for a moment, scanning the tree line and the various outbuildings for any sign of movement. The property felt different now, charged with an undercurrent of menace that hadn't been there that morning. Carlos arrived exactly when he said he would, his dusty Ford pickup raising a small cloud of dust as it approached the house. Michael felt a wave of relief as his friend stepped out of the truck, still wearing his sheriff's deputy uniform and carrying himself with the confident authority that came from years of law enforcement experience. "Miguel," Carlos said, shaking, hands with his characteristic firm grip. "You look like hell. These guys really got to you, didn't they?" "More than I want to admit," Michael replied. "Did you find anything on Blackwood Energy Solutions?" Carlos's expression darkened. "That's the problem. I didn't find much of anything. Company was incorporated in Delaware 3 years ago. Minimal public records. No significant online presence. That's unusual for an energy company. Most legitimate operations want publicity, want people to know about their projects and investments. These guys are operating like they've got something to hide." They walked toward the barn together, Carlos examining the tire tracks with the trained eye of someone who'd worked hundreds of crime scenes. He knelt down next to the deepest impressions, taking photos with his phone and making notes in a small notebook. "Heavy vehicle, probably 6,000 pounds or more," Carlos murmured. "Expensive tires, good tread. These aren't work trucks. This is somebody with money who doesn't want to get stuck in the mud." He looked up at Michael. "You said there were 2. Of them?" "Blackwood and Kane. Blackwood was all smooth talk and expensive suits, but Kane—" Michael shuddered. Kane felt dangerous, like he'd done violence before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. "Tell me about the threats again. Exact words." Michael recounted Kane's comment about Rose's stubbornness being expensive and his ominous reference to her holding out forever. Carlos wrote everything down, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. "Miguel, this is starting to sound like more than just aggressive business tactics. If these guys had something to do with Rose's death..." Carlos trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air between them. "You think she was murdered?" Michael asked, the words feeling strange and terrible in his mouth. "I think Rose was a healthy 78-year-old woman who died suddenly in her sleep with no prior health problems and no autopsy. At the time, it seemed natural. Elderly people pass away peacefully all the time. But now, with these guys pressuring you and making vague threats about what happened to her..." Carlos stood up, brushing dirt off his knees. "Let's take a look at that barn." They approached the weathered structure together, and Carlos immediately noticed the fresh pry marks on the north side. He examined them closely, taking more photos and measurements. "Someone was definitely trying to get inside," he confirmed. "Recent damage, probably within the last few days. You got that key with you?" Michael pulled the ornate brass key from his pocket, surprised to find that his hands were shaking slightly. The weight of decades of mystery, combined with the morning's threats and revelations, had left him feeling unsteady. "You sure you want to do this?" Carlos asked, noticing his friend's nervousness. "Once we open that door, there's no going back to not knowing what Rose was hiding." Michael looked at the barn doors, secured with their heavy chain and ancient padlock. The brass key felt warm in his palm, almost alive with possibility. "She wanted me to have this key for a reason, Carlos. And after everything that's happened today, I need to know what that reason was." As they approached the padlock, Michael's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something about the timing made his stomach clench with apprehension. "Don't answer it," Carlos advised, but Michael was already sliding his finger across the screen. "Mr. Torres," came Blackwood's smooth voice, sounding as confident as if he were sitting in his own office rather than calling from God knew where. "I hope you've had time to consider our generous offer." "I told you I needed time to think," Michael replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Of course. But I'm calling because I'm concerned about your safety, Mr. Torres. Rural properties can be dangerous places, especially for city folks who aren't familiar with the risks. Accidents happen all the time, structural collapses, equipment failures, that sort of thing. Carlos was gesturing frantically for Michael to put the phone on speaker, which he did with trembling fingers. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwood?" Michael asked. "Not at all," came the reply, though there was something cold and predatory beneath the polished tone. "I'm simply pointing out that your grandmother's property has been neglected for years. That old barn, for instance, it looks like it could fall down at any moment. It would be terrible if someone were to get hurt exploring areas that should probably be left alone." Carlos drew his service weapon, not pointing it at anything specific, but making it clear he was ready for trouble. He scanned the tree line while keeping one ear on the conversation. "The barn seems sturdy enough to me," Michael said, though his voice cracked slightly on the words. "Does it? Well, I suppose appearances can be deceiving. Mr. Torres, I want to be very clear about something. My company has been extremely patient with this situation, but patience isn't infinite. Your grandmother learned that lesson the hard way." "What do you mean by that?" Michael demanded, his fear suddenly transforming into anger. "I mean that some opportunities only come once, Mr. Torres. Rose had her chance to do business with us, and she chose unwisely. I'd hate to see you make the same mistake, especially when the consequences could be so much more severe for someone young and healthy like yourself." The line went dead, leaving Michael and Carlos staring at each other in the sudden silence. The threat had been crystal clear, despite never being stated directly. Blackwood was telling him that Rose had been killed for refusing to sell, and that Michael would meet the same fate if he didn't cooperate. "That settles it," Carlos said grimly, holstering his weapon. "We're opening that barn right now, and then we're calling the state police. These guys just escalated this from harassment to making terrorist threats." Michael's hands were shaking even more violently now, but he managed to insert the brass key into the ancient padlock. It turned with surprising ease, as if Rose had kept it oiled and maintained despite keeping the barn locked for decades. The heavy chain fell away with a metallic clatter that seemed unnaturally loud in the rural quiet. Carlos positioned himself to one side of the doors while Michael grabbed the old wooden handles. "On 3, Carlos said quietly. 1, 2. Michael pulled the barn doors open, and both men stepped back as decades of accumulated shadows spilled out into the afternoon sunlight. What they saw inside made them both gasp in amazement and understanding. The barn wasn't filled with rusty farm equipment and moldy hay. Instead, it contained what looked like a makeshift office and archive, with filing cabinets, maps, and technical equipment that clearly didn't belong to the 1940s. But most shocking of all was what hung on the far wall. A large geological survey, map covered in red circles and annotations with "Confidential Barrett Oil Exploration" stamped across the top. Michael's grandmother hadn't been hiding farm equipment. She'd been hiding evidence of one of the largest undiscovered oil reserves in Oklahoma. As they approached the padlock, Michael's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something about the timing made his stomach clench with apprehension. "Don't answer it," Carlos advised, but Michael was already sliding, his finger across the screen. "Mr. Torres," came Blackwood's smooth voice, sounding as confident as if he were sitting in his own office rather than calling from God knew where. "I hope you've had time to consider our generous offer." "I told you I needed time to think," Michael replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Of course. But I'm calling because I'm concerned about your safety, Mr. Torres. rural properties, can be dangerous places, especially for city folks who aren't familiar with the risks. Accidents happen all the time, structural collapses, equipment failures, that sort of thing. Carlos was gesturing frantically for Michael to put the phone on speaker, which he did with trembling fingers. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwood?" Michael asked. "Not at all," came the reply, though there was something cold and predatory beneath the polished tone. "I'm simply pointing out that your grandmother's property has been neglected for years. That old barn, for instance. It looks like it could fall down at any moment. It would be terrible if someone were to get hurt exploring areas that should probably be left alone." Carlos drew his service weapon, not pointing it at anything specific, but making it clear he was ready for trouble. He scanned the tree line while keeping one ear on the conversation. "The barn seems sturdy enough to me," Michael said, though his voice cracked slightly on the words. "Does it? Well, I suppose appearances can be deceiving. Mr. Torres, I want to be very clear about something. My company has been extremely patient with this situation, but patience isn't infinite. Your grandmother learned that lesson the hard way." "What do you mean by that?" Michael demanded, his fear suddenly transforming into anger. "I mean that some opportunities only come once, Mr. Torres. Rose had her chance to do business with us, and she chose unwisely. I'd hate to see you make the same mistake, especially when the consequences could be so much more severe for someone young and healthy like yourself." The line went dead, leaving Michael and Carlos staring at each other in the sudden silence. The threat had been crystal clear, despite never being stated directly. Blackwood was telling him that Rose had been killed for refusing to sell, and that Michael would meet the same fate if he didn't cooperate. "That settles it," Carlos said grimly, holstering his weapon. "We're opening that barn right now, and then we're calling the state police. These guys just escalated this from harassment to making terrorist threats." Michael's hands were shaking even more violently now, but he managed to insert the brass key into the ancient padlock. It turned with surprising ease, as if Rose had kept it oiled and maintained despite keeping the barn locked for decades. The heavy chain fell away with a metallic clatter that seemed unnaturally loud in the rural quiet. Carlos positioned himself to one side of the doors while Michael grabbed the old wooden handles. "On 3, Carlos said quietly. 1, 2. Michael pulled the barn doors open, and both men stepped back as decades of accumulated shadows spilled out into the afternoon sunlight. What they saw inside made them both gasp in amazement and understanding. The barn wasn't filled with rusty farm equipment and moldy hay. Instead, it contained what looked like a makeshift office and archive, with filing cabinets, maps, and technical equipment that clearly didn't belong to the 1940s. But most shocking of all was what hung on the far wall, a large geological survey, map covered in red circles and annotations, with confidential, Barrett oil exploration stamped across the top. Michael's grandmother hadn't been hiding farm equipment. She'd been hiding evidence of one of the largest undiscovered oil reserves in Oklahoma, called Blackwood Energy Solutions. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Miguel, that's a lot of money for 160 acres of farmland. Even good farmland. That's what I thought too. But Carlos, one of them, this guy Kane, he said something about Rose that made it sound like maybe her death wasn't as natural as we thought." Another pause, longer this time. "What exactly did he say?" Michael recounted the conversation, paying special attention to Kane's words about stubbornness being expensive and Rose's refusal to hold out forever. The way he said, "Look where it got her," Carlos, it sounded like a threat, but also like he knew something about what happened to her. "Miguel, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't go back to that property alone. In fact, don't go back there at all until I can run these guys through the system and see what comes up. Blackwood Energy Solutions, you said?" "Yeah." Richard Blackwood was the smooth talker. Kane was the muscle. Professional operation, expensive clothes, the whole 9 yards, I'll check them out and meet you at the farm in about an hour. I want to take a look at those tire tracks you mentioned and see if there's any other evidence of tampering. But Miguel, if these guys show up again, you call me immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself. After hanging up, Michael sat in his car outside the gas station, trying to process everything that had happened. 3 hours ago, he'd driven to Rose's farm expecting to reminisce about his grandmother and maybe poke around the property. Now he was sitting with a $2.3 million offer in his pocket and a growing suspicion that his grandmother's death might not have been the peaceful passing everyone had assumed. His phone buzzed with another message, this time from Jennifer. Bradley told me about your inheritance adventure. Mom thinks you should just sell the place and split the money with the family since it should have been divided equally anyway. Just saying. The casual cruelty of the message hit him like a slap. Even now, with everything that was happening, his family's first instinct was to find a way to profit from his situation. The idea that he should sell Rose's property and split the money with the same people who had mocked both him and the farm just hours earlier was so absurd. It made him angry, but more than that, it made him determined. Whatever Rose had hidden in that barn, whatever secret had made Blackwood Energy Solutions willing to pay millions for seemingly worthless land, his family didn't deserve to benefit from it. They'd written off both him and Rose years ago. They'd made their choice, and now they could live with the consequences. Michael scrolled through his contacts and called his closest friend from art school, a guy named David who worked as an investigative journalist for the Tulsa World. If anyone could help him research Blackwood Energy Solutions and figure out what they really wanted with Rose's land, it would be David. Michael Torres, how's the starving artist life treating you? David answered with his characteristic humor. Actually, I think I might have stumbled onto something big. You ever heard of a company called Blackwood Energy Solutions? Energy company? Doesn't ring a bell, but that doesn't mean much. Why? Michael gave David the abbreviated version of events, focusing on the mysterious offer and the implied threats. David's tone became more serious as the story progressed. Okay, that's definitely sketchy, David said when Michael finished. Energy companies don't usually offer millions for farmland unless there's something specific they want. Oil, natural, gas, mineral rights, something like that. You know anything about your grandmother's property contracts? Not really. I mean, I know she and my grandfather bought the place in the 1940s, but I never saw any of the paperwork. Well, that paperwork might be the key to everything. Property deeds, mineral rights agreements, oil and gas leases. That stuff could explain why these guys are so interested. Plus, if they're willing to offer $2.3 million up front, the property is probably worth a lot more than that. Michael felt a spark of hope. Could you help me research this? I mean, officially? You bet. This sounds like exactly the kind of story my editor loves. Corporate interests pressuring ordinary people, potential environmental issues, maybe even some corruption if these guys have been throwing their weight around with other landowners. Give me everything you know about Blackwood Energy Solutions, and I'll start digging. After providing David with all the details he could remember, Michael felt slightly better about his situation. He wasn't alone in this, and he had people he could trust. Carlos would handle the security and law enforcement angle, David would investigate the corporate side, and Michael could focus on what Rose had wanted him to find in that barn. But first, he needed to get back to the property and make sure Blackwood and Kane were gone. He also needed to get inside that barn before they figured out another way to force their way in. Whatever Rose had hidden there, it was clearly valuable enough to kill for. The thought made him check his mirrors again as he drove back toward the farm. This time, he noticed a dark sedan that seemed to be following him at a distance, staying just far enough back to avoid being obvious, but close enough to keep track of his movements. Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Blackwood and Kane weren't just making business offers, they were actively surveilling him. The question was how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted, and whether Michael would be able to stay ahead of them long enough to uncover the truth about Rose's legacy. Part 7. The line crossed. Point of no return. 58%. Carlos crouched behind a stack of wooden crates near the barn's entrance, his service weapon drawn and ready. Through the gaps in the weathered siding, he could see at least 6 men spreading out across the property with military precision. These weren't corporate executives anymore. They were a tactical team dressed in dark clothing, carrying equipment that definitely wasn't standard business gear. "Miguel, get to the back of the barn," Carlos whispered urgently. "There's got to be another way out. Maybe a window or a back door." Michael clutched the evidence bag to his chest and moved deeper into the shadows, his heart pounding so hard he was sure it could be heard across the property. The barn felt enormous and claustrophobic at the same time, filled with 70 years of accumulated secrets that had already cost his grandfather his life, and possibly his grandmother too. Outside, Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the still afternoon air. "Mr. Torres, I know you're in there. This doesn't have to end badly for anyone. We're reasonable people, and I'm sure we can work out an arrangement that benefits everyone." Carlos caught Michael's eye and shook his head grimly. They both knew there would be no negotiation, no arrangement. These people had killed to protect their secret for decades, and they weren't going to stop now. Michael found what he was looking for at the back of the barn, a small loading door that his grandfather had probably used to move hay bales in and out during the farm's working days. The door was secured with a simple wooden latch that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, but the hinges were still solid. "Carlos," he whispered, gesturing toward the door. But before Carlos could respond, Kane's voice cut through the air, like a blade. "We know Deputy Mendoza is with you, Torres. Law enforcement involvement makes this more complicated, but not impossible. We've dealt with curious cops before." The implication was crystal clear, and Carlos's face went pale with anger. These bastards were threatening to kill a sheriff's deputy to protect their oil rights. He keyed the radio on his shoulder, speaking, in code that would hopefully bring backup without alerting the men outside to exactly what was happening. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. Code Black at the Torres property, multiple suspects. Officer needs assistance immediately. Repeat, Code Black, officer in immediate danger." The response crackled through his radio. "Unit 47, backup is 20 minutes out. Can you maintain your position?" 20 minutes. Michael looked at Carlos with desperate eyes. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours with armed mercenaries surrounding the barn and closing in fast. Outside, they could hear footsteps approaching the barn doors. Someone was testing the chain they'd left hanging loose after opening the padlock. Michael realized with growing horror that they'd left obvious evidence of their entry. The unlocked barn doors were like a giant sign announcing their presence. "Mr. Torres," Blackwood called out, his voice closer now, probably standing right outside the entrance. "I'm going to make this very simple. You have something that belongs to my company. Research data, geological surveys, proprietary information that was obtained illegally by your grandparents. We're prepared to compensate you generously for its return, but our patience has limits." Michael wanted to shout back that the land belonged to his family, that Blackwood Energy had no right to anything on the property. But Carlos held up a warning hand, reminding him that silence was their only advantage right now. Kane, Blackwood, continued, "Check the perimeter. Make sure they don't have an alternative exit route." The sound of heavy boots circling the barn made Michael's stomach clench with fear. In minutes, maybe seconds, Kane would discover the loading door, and their only escape route would be compromised. Carlos seemed to be thinking the same thing. He was checking his weapon and looking at the door with the expression of someone calculating very bad odds. Michael's phone buzzed with another text message. "Your family has a history of making poor decisions, Mr. Torres. Your grandfather chose defiance over cooperation. Your grandmother chose secrecy over openness. Both paid the ultimate price for their stubbornness. You have 30 seconds to walk out of that barn voluntarily, or we'll come in and collect what we need from your body." The message felt like a death sentence, but it also contained something else. a confession. They weren't even bothering to hide their involvement in Thomas and Rose's deaths anymore. These text messages were evidence, if anyone survived to present them. Carlos was at the loading door now, carefully lifting the wooden latch. The hinges creaked softly as he opened it just enough to peer outside. What he saw made him curse under his breath. 2 men covering the back of the barn, he whispered to Michael. Professional positions, good sight lines. They're not giving us any easy exits. That's when Michael heard a sound that made his blood freeze. The distinctive metallic clicking of someone cutting through the chain on the barn doors with bolt cutters. In seconds, Blackwood's men would be inside, and Carlos's service weapon wouldn't be nearly enough to hold off 6 armed mercenaries in close quarters. "Time's up, Mr. Torres," Blackwood called out. "We're coming in." Carlos made a split-second decision that would either save their lives or get them both killed. He yanked the loading door fully open and shoved Michael through it, following immediately behind. "Run for the tree line," he hissed. "Don't stop. Don't look back. Just run. The E." 2 men covering the rear of the barn were caught off guard by the sudden movement, but they recovered quickly. Michael heard the sharp crack of gunfire as Carlos returned fire, buying them precious seconds to reach the cover of the oak trees that bordered the property. Branches tore at Michael's face and clothing as he crashed through the underbrush, the evidence bag clutched desperately to his chest. Behind him, more gunshots echoed across the property as Carlos engaged in a running firefight with professional killers who had probably done this before. Michael's phone was buzzing constantly now, with incoming calls from the same unknown number, but he didn't dare stop to answer. He could hear vehicles starting up, engines roaring to life as Blackwood's team repositioned to cut off their escape route to the main road. That's when he realized that Carlos was no longer behind him. The gunfire had stopped, and the forest had gone ominously quiet except for the sound of his own ragged breathing and pounding footsteps. Michael Torres, who 12 hours earlier had been nothing more than a struggling graphic designer inheriting a worthless farm, was now a fugitive running for his life through the Oklahoma wilderness, with evidence of a multi-generational conspiracy that had already claimed at least 3 lives. And somewhere behind him in the growing darkness, the people who had killed. His grandparents were hunting him with the same cold efficiency they'd used for decades to protect their billion-dollar secret. Part 8. Response Initiation and Skill Revelation, 58 to 67%. Michael crashed through the dense Oklahoma underbrush, thorns tearing at his clothes and branches whipping across his face as he fought his way deeper into the woods that bordered his grandmother's property. The evidence bag clutched against his chest felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but he refused to let go of the documents that had cost his family so much blood. Behind him, the gunfire had stopped completely. The silence was somehow worse than the shooting. At least when Carlos had been returning fire, Michael knew his friend was still alive. Now, with only the sound of his own ragged breathing and pounding footsteps echoing through the trees, he feared the worst. His phone buzzed again with another call from Blackwood's number, but Michael ignored it. He needed to focus on moving, on staying ahead of the professional killers who were undoubtedly tracking him through the forest right now. The problem was that Michael had spent his adult life in Tulsa apartments and art studios, not wilderness survival situations. These woods, which had seemed magical and endless during childhood visits to Rose's farm, now felt like a maze designed to trap him. But as panic threatened to overwhelm him, something Rose had taught him during those long-ago summer afternoons came flooding back. "This land has memory, mijo," she used to say as they walked through these same trees. "It remembers everyone who ever loved it, everyone who ever protected it. If you listen carefully, it will help you when you need it most." The time Michael had thought she was just being poetic. Now, slowing his desperate flight for a moment to actually listen to the landscape around him, he began to remember details that his conscious mind had forgotten. The old creek bed that ran roughly parallel to the main road, providing both cover and a navigation guide. the abandoned deer blind that he and his grandfather had built when Michael was 12, hidden in a cluster of oak trees about half a mile from the barn. Most importantly, he remembered the emergency escape route that Rose had shown him during one of their walks, a path that led to old Frank Whitman's property and connected to a back road that Blackwood's men probably didn't know about. Michael adjusted his course, moving more deliberately now instead of just crashing blindly through the underbrush. His graphic design training, which had taught him to think spatially and visualize layouts, helped him reconstruct the mental map of the property that he'd built during countless childhood explorations. As he made his way toward the creek bed, Michael heard the sound he'd been dreading: multiple vehicles moving along the roads that bordered the property, engines gunning as Blackwood's team repositioned to cut off his escape routes. They were treating this like a military operation, which meant they had experience hunting people through terrain exactly like this. But they didn't know the land the way Michael did. They didn't know about the creek bed that couldn't be seen from the roads, or the deer paths that Rose had taught him to recognize, or the fact that the property boundaries extended much further east than most people realized. Michael's phone rang again, and this time he answered it while continuing to move through the trees. "Mr. Torres," came Blackwood's voice, no longer smooth and polished but tight with anger. "You're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. We have your friend, and his condition depends entirely on your cooperation." Michael's heart sank, but he forced himself to keep moving. "What do you want?" "I want you to stop running through the woods like a scared rabbit and start acting like an intelligent man who understands the reality of his situation. You have documents that belong to my company. Return them, and we can discuss compensation for your family's inconvenience. Over the years, those documents prove you murdered my grandfather," Michael said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Blackwood laughed, a cold sound that carried no humor. "Your grandfather died of a heart attack, Mr. Torres. Natural causes, just like your grandmother died peacefully in her sleep. Sometimes the stress of fighting a losing battle against progress can be overwhelming for elderly people." The casual admission of guilt made Michael's blood boil, but it also crystallized his determination. These people had been terrorizing his family for decades, killing anyone who stood in the way of their greed. The only way to honor Rose and Thomas's memory was to make sure their deaths hadn't been in vain. "Here's my counteroffer," Michael said, reaching the creek bed and using the cover of the bank to mask his movements. "Go to hell." He hung up and immediately called David at the Tulsa World, praying that his friend would answer despite the late hour. "Michael? Jesus, where are you? I've been trying to call you for hours. I found some seriously fucked up stuff about Blackwood Energy Solutions." "I'm being hunted by them right now," Michael said quietly, keeping his voice low as he moved along. "The creek. They killed Carlos. Or at least they have him. David, I need you to do something for me right now, tonight." "What do you need?" "I'm going to email you photos of documents from my phone. Evidence that Blackwood Energy has been murdering people to steal oil rights for the past 60 years. If something happens to me, if I don't make it out of this, you have to promise me you'll publish everything. Michael, you need to call the FBI, the state police, somebody with guns who can help you. I tried. Backup is 20 minutes away, but I don't think I have 20 minutes. These guys are professionals, and they've been doing this for decades." Michael paused at a fallen log that he remembered from childhood, one that marked the halfway point to Frank Whitman's property. "David, promise me, if I don't make it, you publish everything. Don't let my family die for nothing." "You're going to make it," David said firmly. "But yes, I promise. Send me everything you have." Michael began photographing documents with his phone camera, uploading them to the cloud, and emailing them to David as quickly as his fingers could work. Rose's final note, the photographs of Blackwood and Kane, pages from Thomas's journal documenting the threats and intimidation, the geological survey showing the massive oil reserves, everything that proved the scope of the conspiracy. As he worked, Michael heard something that made his blood freeze, the distant sound of dogs barking. Blackwood's team had brought tracking dogs to hunt him through the forest. "David, they've got dogs," Michael whispered into the phone. "I have to go. Everything's uploaded. Remember your promise." "Michael, wait." He hung up and broke into a run again, no longer worried about noise discipline. The dogs changed everything. His knowledge of the land would only help him for so long before the animals tracked him down. But as he ran toward what he hoped was safety, Michael realized something important had changed. He was no longer running just to save his own life. He was running to preserve the evidence that would finally bring justice for Rose and Thomas Torres, and for whatever other victims Blackwood Energy had claimed over the decades. The scared, overwhelmed graphic designer who had inherited a worthless farm that morning was gone. In his place was a man who understood exactly what his grandmother had been trying to tell him about the land having memory, about the importance of fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. Michael Torres was no longer running away from something. He was running toward the moment when he would finally make Blackwood Energy pay for 60 years of murder and greed. Part 9. Complete Demonstration and Resolution. 67-75%. Michael burst through the tree line at the edge of Frank Whitman's property, his lungs burning and his legs shaking from the adrenaline-fueled sprint through the forest. Behind him, the sound of tracking dogs was getting closer, their baying echoing through the Oklahoma night like the howls of hellhounds. But ahead of him lay salvation, Frank's old farmhouse with its porch light burning bright against the darkness. He pounded on the front door with desperate urgency, glancing back toward the woods where flashlight beams were beginning to cut through the trees. Frank Whitman answered the door in his bathrobe, his ancient hearing aids squealing with feedback as he squinted at Michael's torn and bloodied appearance. "Michael Torres? What in the Sam Hill are you doing here at this hour, boy? You look like you've been wrestling with a pack of wildcats." "Frank, I need to use your phone," Michael gasped, pushing past the elderly man into the house. "There are men with guns hunting me, and they killed my friend Carlos. We need to call the FBI right now." Frank's eyes went wide, but decades of living through everything from the Dust Bowl to Desert Storm had taught him not to question when young people showed up at his door asking for help. He handed Michael his cordless phone without hesitation. Michael dialed 911, and when the dispatcher answered, he spoke with a clarity and authority that surprised him. "This is Michael Torres at 47 County Road 47. I need FBI agents and state police at this location immediately. I have evidence of multiple homicides committed by Blackwood Energy Solutions, including the murder of Sheriff's Deputy Carlos Mendoza. Within the last hour, the suspects are armed and extremely dangerous." As he spoke, Michael could see flashlight beams moving through Frank's property, searching the outbuildings and getting closer to the house. The tracking dogs had led Blackwood's men directly to them. "Sir, I'm dispatching units to your location now," the 911 operator said. "Can you stay on the line?" "I don't think we have that luxury," Michael replied, watching Kane's distinctive silhouette approaching the front porch. "They're here." Frank Whitman might have been 83 years old and half-deaf, but he'd been a Marine in Vietnam, and he recognized a tactical situation when he saw one. Without a word, he disappeared into his bedroom and returned with a pump-action shotgun that looked like it had seen action in 3 different wars. "Nobody comes into my house uninvited," Frank said grimly, racking a shell into the chamber. "Especially not the kind of sons of bitches who hunt down young folks with dogs." The front door exploded inward as Kane kicked it off its hinges, but he wasn't expecting to face a combat veteran armed with a shotgun. Frank's first blast caught Kane's center mass, sending the big man flying backward off the porch in a spray of blood and torn clothing. "Get down!" Frank shouted to Michael, who dove behind the kitchen counter as automatic weapons fire shattered the front windows. These weren't corporate intimidation tactics anymore. This was a full-scale assault on a civilian home by mercenaries who had decided that eliminating witnesses was their only remaining option. But Blackwood had made a crucial miscalculation. Frank Whitman's house sat on a hill that provided excellent defensive positions and clear sight lines in all directions. More importantly, the gunfire and explosions had awakened every neighbor within a 5-mile radius, and rural Oklahoma folks took a dim view of people shooting up their friends' homes in the middle of the night. Michael's phone rang, and David's number appeared on the screen. He answered while staying low behind the counter as bullets whined overhead. "Michael, I published everything online 20 minutes ago. It's already going viral. The oil reserve estimates, the murder evidence, Rose's letter, everything. Local news stations are picking it up, and I just got calls from CNN and the Washington Post. Whatever happens tonight, the whole world is going to know what Blackwood Energy did to your family." Through the chaos of gunfire and shattering glass, Michael felt a surge of triumph. Rose's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The truth was out, spreading across the internet faster than Blackwood's damage control teams could ever hope to contain it. Frank was methodically returning fire from different windows, using his knowledge of his own property to stay one step ahead of the attackers. "Michael!" he called out. "I count 4 men still moving out there, but they're pulling back toward the road. Sounds like sirens coming from town." Indeed, the distant wail of multiple emergency vehicles was growing louder by the minute. The 911 call had triggered a massive response from every law enforcement agency in the county, and Blackwood's men were running out of time to clean up their mess. Michael's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This isn't over, Torres. We'll find you wherever you go." But even as he read the threat, Michael could hear the sound of helicopters approaching from the east. Not Blackwood's aircraft, but law enforcement choppers with searchlights that turned the night into day. The tracking dogs that had been hunting him were now confused by the scent of a dozen new people converging on the property. Through Frank's shattered front window, Michael watched Blackwood himself retreating toward the black Suburban, shouting orders to his remaining men as they made a fighting withdrawal toward the main road. But it was too late. Police cars were blocking every exit route, and the aerial surveillance made it impossible for them to disappear into the night the way they'd probably done dozens of times before. 45 minutes later, Michael stood in Frank Whitman's living room watching Blackwood and 3 of his surviving mercenaries being led away in handcuffs by FBI agents. Kane was in an ambulance, alive but facing multiple felony charges along with his employer. Agent Sarah Martinez, the FBI's lead investigator, handed Michael a cup of coffee and smiled grimly. "Mr. Torres, thanks to your evidence and your friend. David's quick thinking in publishing everything online, we've got enough evidence to put these people away for the rest of their lives. We're also reopening the investigations into your grandfather's death and several other suspicious fatalities." Going back decades, Michael looked out at the property that had seemed so worthless just 12 hours earlier. The barn where Rose had hidden her secrets was now crawling with federal agents collecting evidence. The land that his family had mocked as a burden was about to make him one of the wealthiest men in Oklahoma. But more importantly, the truth that Rose and Thomas had died protecting was finally free. 6 months later, Michael Torres stood on the wraparound porch of Rose's farmhouse, watching the sunrise paint the Oklahoma sky in shades of gold and crimson. The house had been completely restored, its white siding gleaming with fresh paint, and its shutters hanging straight and true for the first time in decades. The porch no longer sagged. It had been rebuilt with the same limestone foundation that had supported the old barn where Rose had kept her secrets. In his hands, Michael held a copy of the Tulsa World, with a headline that still made him smile. Blackwood Energy CEO sentenced to life without parole in multi-decade murder conspiracy. Richard Blackwood and Kane were spending their remaining years in federal prison, along with a dozen other executives and mercenaries who had participated in what the judge called one of the most systematic and callous criminal enterprises in American corporate history. But the real victory wasn't in the courthouse. It was in the simple fact that Michael was standing here at all, alive and free to honor the memory of the 2 people who had loved him enough to fight for something bigger than themselves. His phone buzzed with a text from Bradley. "Hey cuz, saw the news about your oil money again. Mom still thinks the family deserves a share since we're all Rose's grandchildren. Maybe we could work something out?" Michael deleted the message without responding, just as he'd done with the dozens of similar attempts from his relatives over the past months. They'd made their choice long ago, deciding that Rose's legacy was worthless and Michael himself was a failure. Now that the worthless farm was generating millions in oil revenue that Michael was using to fund scholarships for underprivileged art students and environmental protection initiatives, suddenly they wanted to be family again. Some lessons Michael had learned came too late to matter. The screen door creaked open behind him, and Carlos Mendoza stepped onto the porch, his left arm still in a sling from the bullet wound he'd sustained during their escape from the barn. The doctor said he'd make a full recovery, though he'd carry the scar for the rest of his life, as a reminder of how close they'd both come to joining Rose and Thomas in whatever justice waited beyond this world. "Miguel," Carlos said, settling into one of the new rocking chairs that Michael had bought to match the ones Rose used to have. The FBI called. They found evidence linking Blackwood Energy to at least 12 other suspicious deaths across Oklahoma and Texas going back to the 1960s. "Your grandfather and grandmother weren't the only ones who refused to sell their land." Michael nodded, unsurprised. The more investigators dug into Blackwood's operations, the more bodies they found. Farmers, ranchers, tribal leaders, anyone who had stood between the company and the oil reserves they coveted. Rose and Thomas had been part of a much larger pattern of corporate murder that had gone undetected for decades. "There's something else," Carlos continued. "The families of the other victims want to meet with you. They're talking about creating some kind of memorial, maybe a foundation to make sure this never happens again." Michael smiled, imagining what Rose would think about her quiet resistance inspiring a movement for justice. "She'd like that," he said. "She always said the land has memory. Maybe it's time we helped people remember what really happened here." David Martinez's rental car pulled into the driveway, dust trailing behind it like a golden ribbon in the morning light. Michael's friend had won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the Blackwood conspiracy, but he still made the drive from Tulsa every few weeks to check on Michael and work on the book they were writing together about Rose's courage and the corporate corruption that had cost so many lives. As David approached the porch, Michael thought about the letter he'd found in Rose's bedroom after the FBI had finished processing the house as a crime scene. Written in her careful handwriting and dated just a week before her death, it had been addressed simply to, "My dear Miguel. If you are reading this, then the truth has finally come to light, and the people who killed your grandfather have been stopped. I always knew you would be the one to finish what Thomas and I started, not because you were the strongest or the bravest, but because you were the kindest. You saw value in things that others dismissed as worthless. You spent time with an old woman when your successful cousins couldn't be bothered. You understood that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the love we show each other and the principles we're willing to defend. The oil money will make you rich, mijo, but don't let it change who you are. Use it to help people the way you helped me, the way you'll help others I'll never meet. Remember that this land chose you just as much as you chose it. It waited for someone who would listen to its stories and honor its memory. Be proud of who you are, Miguel. You are exactly the man I hoped you would become." Michael folded the newspaper and looked out across the 160 acres that had transformed his life. The old windmill was turning again, its blades catching the morning breeze as it pumped water for the restored vegetable garden where Rose had taught him to see beauty in simple things. The barn had been preserved as a museum, its walls now displaying the evidence that had brought down Blackwood Energy, alongside photographs of Thomas and Rose during their happier years. Carlos and David joined him at the porch railing, and for a moment, the three men stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher into the endless Oklahoma sky. "You know what the strangest part is?" Michael said finally. "My family spent years telling me I was a failure, that I'd never amount to anything. But Rose saw something in me that they couldn't see. She believed I was worth leaving her most precious possession to, even though it put me in danger. Maybe That's the point, Carlos replied. Real family isn't about blood or DNA. It's about who shows up when things get difficult. Who sees your worth when you can't see it yourself? Michael nodded, thinking about all the people who had dismissed him over the years. His cousins who mocked his artistic dreams. His relatives who saw him as the family disappointment. Even his own doubts about whether he deserved Rose's faith in him. But Rose had looked past all of that and seen something worth believing in. The lesson she'd taught him wasn't just about standing up to corporate bullies or protecting family land. It was about the revolutionary act of seeing value where others saw nothing, of choosing love over greed, of believing that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they refused to give up on what mattered most. As the three friends sat down to share breakfast on the restored porch, Michael felt Rose's presence in the warm morning breeze, in the rich smell of the earth she'd protected, in the knowledge that sometimes the most worthless-looking inheritance can turn out to be the most precious gift of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.